economic business.
Something else.
Why are you in the bar right now?
Sir, you have to stay in your seat. You can't walk around with that camera, okay? Excuse me, sir. I'm with the Office of Communications and Public Affairs.
Did I say anything wrong?
No, it's just that when you walked in, you were filming people while we were working. You don't have the authority to film people. Without their permission. This is a public event, that's one thing. So you can sit here and you can videotape this, but we want you to stay in your seat.
You know, someone's already told me all this.
I understand, I just wanted to make sure.
You don't need to tell me again.
Well, I understand.
You're wasting your time. Go away. Leave me alone. I'm sitting in my seat.
I understand.
You're bothering me. You're harassing me.
I'm not harassing.
Yes, you are. Someone's already told me this. I agreed. So I'm sitting here. I'm not doing anything wrong.
I represent the university.
And?
These are the organizers of the event.
So?
You have to listen to what they say, because if you don't, then you can be removed from the building. And I know you came to enjoy the event, so enjoy the event and please conform with what the people are asking you to do.
I am.
They are the organizers.
You're bothering me, sir. Would you go away? You're bothering me.
If you're rude.
I'm sitting in the chair. I'm not doing anything wrong. Someone's already told me what you're telling me.
Instructions. I hope I don't have to come back.
I hope you don't come back.
Yes? Okay, very good. Welcome. I'm Nick Lemon, the Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia, and thank you all for coming tonight. This is a big crowd because even though we have lots and lots of exciting events, this is an especially exciting event, and that's why we've moved it from the humble precincts of the Journalism School to the grand room here in Low Library. This event involves planets lining up in a very fortuitous way. The New York Times is publishing a Wikileaks book, and called us and said, can we have an event? And it just so happened that we were able to procure the panelist services not only of Bill Keller of the Times, but also of Alan Rusbridger of the Guardian and Jack Goldmsith of Harvard Law School. All of whom will be introduced more fully in a minute. And that combined with a subject that is of completely obsessive interest to people interested in journalism and foreign policy and national security, and pretty high interest to everybody else too, has made this what is sure to be a very memorable evening. I have one small logistical note, which is that courtesy of the New York Times, there's a room behind here called the faculty room. So many of you have been there before, and there's free food and drinks after this event in that room for anybody who cares to come. Our moderator tonight is Emily Bell, who is still in her first year on the faculty of Columbia Journalism School. She has come to us from the Guardian, where she ran digital operations brilliantly. And she is the director of the relatively brand new Tao Center for Digital Journalism. I believe somewhere in the audience are the primary benefactors of the Tao Center, Len and Emily Tao, so I wanted to say hi to them if you're out there anywhere. And thank you for what you've done to help make events like this possible. Emily, come on up. Okay, fair enough. Sit down, but take over and I will go sit down. Thanks again, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for that introduction. As I say, it's as Nick said, this is a really auspicious evening because we've all watched, I think, fascinated in the last 6 months as one of the really great news stories, and also one of the great stories about journalism has unfolded in front of our eyes over the last 6 months. And it's enormously exciting to have two of the principals here with us on the panel tonight. The format of the evening is that we are going to, I'm going to hog the questions for the first half an hour or so, but I know we've got an awful lot of people in the audience with a great deal of expertise. So there'll be plenty of time to ask questions yourself, and we have roving mics. We're really lucky to have, as Nick said, 3 people on the panel, though we should probably, because of Jack Goldsmith here, who I'll introduce first, who's on my very far left, though probably only physically, not politically. Jack is former Assistant Attorney General during the Bush administration. He's now a Harvard Law professor, but he's also an expert in national security law, internet law, international law, so he's actually playing the part of about 15 different lawyers tonight, so we're very pleased that he's here. Next to him we have my former boss and the editor-in-chief of the Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, and next to him we have Bill Keller, the editor of the New York Times. I give them no introduction because I see as a highly journalistic crowd, you probably know exactly who they are and what they've been doing. I thought we'd start really at the beginning. And that means we're in the beginning with you, Alan. Would you like to tell us how this incredible story started and what your first contact with Wikileaks was and how we got where we are today?
Well, with us it started with a reporter called Nick Davis on The Guardian who read the story of Bradley Manning and read how Julian Assange was essentially on the run. I don't think that's too dramatic a way of putting it. He was a man who had an amazing treasure trove of documents, and Nick thought he would be an interesting man to seek out, and he eventually made contact. They met in Brussels, and Nick persuaded him that it would be better, rather than crudely dumping this stuff on the internet, if he worked with The Guardian and the mainstream media. And early on in the conversation he introduced the New York Times as a way of gaining more impact of making sense of the documents, and so on. And I think that was Julian Assange agreed, and we took it from there. I think Nick's judgment call has been borne out by events. I think it was, we had three reasons for bringing the New York Times. One was because the British media laws are not as robust as America's media laws. So we thought that would give our joint enterprise a kind of legal robustness. Secondly, we thought it would give us a kind of technological robustness. If anybody was going to try and bring down this enterprise through digital attack, it would be more robust with more than one organisation. And thirdly, I think he rightly thought that this was going to be a massive task. In the end, we calculated there were 300 million words in this, just in the cable gates alone. And you compare that with 2.5 million words in the Pentagon Papers. This was, I think, the biggest amount of data that any journalistic organisations ever had to tackle. And it was just going to be necessary to bring as many eyes as possible to the enterprise. So that's how it started, and I think it started well, and as far as we were concerned, up to December the 22nd, when we jointly brought down the curtain, I think it ended pretty well.
Well, we'll get to December the 22nd in a little bit, but just going back to say, so your first contact when Nick brought Julian Assange in, as you say, the kind of task was huge. What would you, as an editor, what were you thinking when you took hold of this enormous amount of data? What were your first concerns in terms of ethics and process? And did you at any point think this is actually kind of something which is going to be too difficult to do?
Well, we rapidly realised, and I think Bill has said the same, that we realised that the skills we had on the journalistic side were barely up to the task. It's been sort of quite interesting to watch the meeting of the technological side and the editorial side of the Guardian as people who've been dining next door to each other in the canteen for years suddenly got to know each other. David, this is Harold, Harold, this is David, and they could do things that neither of them really fully appreciated. So that's been a very high learning curve, including how to build search engines across data and how to manipulate these vast amounts of information. So that was the first learning curve, and then we were straight into the ethical issues of highly sensitive, whether or not it's highly secret we can probably discuss, but it was highly sensitive information, and the ethical difficulties with each group, which were all difficult. We're all different. The Iraq batch was largely historic. Afghan was very much not historic, and the Cablegate stuff had all kinds of issues. So, the first issue was: are we going to publish these raw, or are we going to redact them? And we rapidly came to the conclusion that we had to redact them. It would be completely irresponsible to publish this material raw. And
at that point, what was your dialogue with Wikileaks about that? Were they relatively kind of open-minded about the redaction? Because obviously it went against some of what had been said previously about putting raw data in the...
Well, I think that was the first culture clash, to the extent that I think WikiLeaks came to this from the point of view of assuming that they would publish it all raw, and from a point of view of total transparency. And I think by the end of the exercise, by December, WikiLeaks had essentially adopted the position of the 5 mainstream media organisations, which was a measure of redaction was necessary, and they adopted all our redactions. So that was a case of these two different cultures, which began in different places, converging.
And I think so. One of the questions that comes up over and over again is you've explained a little bit about why you've collaborated, and this is a very sort of unique operation in that I don't think it's been seen before to have so many different news organisations collaborating. You're saying that's a right decision, but the media is pretty global. So if the Guardian had simply sort of ploughed on by itself, do you actually think you would have come under pressure in the way that you were fearing at the beginning? Because it doesn't seem as though you've been in the same position perhaps as Bill Keller. in terms of either the government or the law?
Well, we've had a couple of instances in the past 2 years where highly important but undoubtedly confidential information has been injuncted in a way that I think is virtually impossible in America. I'm looking to Bill or to Jack. So there was a case involving an oil company called Traffic Europe who had been accused of I must be careful, dumping a lot of toxic material in the Ivory Coast new sentence, and lots of people became ill at the same time. There were internal documents there which, in the end, it was even suggested we could not report how this was being discussed in Parliament. Those documents ended up on Wikileaks. Another case involving tax avoidance by Barclays Bank, internal documents, midnight injunction, judges woken up in their pajamas and ordered to take them down. And so we had no confidence that that these highly sensitive governmental documents would not be injuncted either by the American government or by the British government. And that's why, we felt the rock of the First Amendment in America was going to be vital.
So Bill Keller, bring you in at this point.
Alan's doing just fine.
Tell me, yes, I say, that we could listen to him all night, but we'd like to hear from you as well, which is, tell me about, again, that first contact with the Guardian and when they rang, and because I suspect that your thought processes on it was probably slightly different.
Well, the day was Alan who called me, and a state which I would characterize as mildly paranoid, which is a sort of natural state for anybody who's hung around with the Wikileaks people for a while, and wanted to know how we could have a secure conversation. And I informed him that the New York Times is not the national security agency. We don't have secure lines. We're a cone of silence. And so he, in a very kind of cautious way, laid out for me this proposition that there were, at that point, 500,000 documents, war dispatches relating to Iraq and Afghanistan that had come from WikiLeaks, and we were being offered to share this exclusive, and was I interested? And clearly I was. I had no misgivings about working with Alan. I had some misgivings about the trustworthiness of the source. And after consulting with our lawyers, I had the same misgivings Alan has about, really more about British law than American law. I think because the possession of the material in question was then in London, and the ability of the British government to enjoin publication is considerably greater than under American law.
Well, can I just ask at this point, when you're saying you had reservations about the source, which we're really talking about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange here, if that approach had been made to you directly, what would you have done, do you think?
I'd like to think I would have been generous enough to call Alan and ask him if he wanted to share. Let's pretend that's what I would have done. I think, we would have proceeded in more or less the same way. I mean, your default position when sources offer you secret documents, and they're sources you haven't dealt with before, is misgivings. Sources come with agendas. You don't always know exactly what they are. They don't always tell you candidly what their agendas are. WikiLeaks was not completely unknown to us. They had just the previous April released the cockpit footage of military helicopters over Baghdad shooting a group of people that included 2 Reuters journalists.
Politically, did it make it easier to make the decision to publish, particularly in an American paper, the fact that it would come through the Guardian?
I don't think so. I mean, if anything, I suppose you could argue that it made it a bit more complicated in the respect that, while the Times, I believe, is and tries very hard to be impartial under the sort of American standards of journalism, European news organizations are more openly partial. and the Guardian, which I respect immensely, is in that tradition a paper of the left. So, associating ourselves with the paper of the left, and then when Der Spiegel entered the picture, and then Le Monde, and then El País, all of them, none of them the Weekly Standard. The question came up, are we going to be pilloried not for doing business with WikiLeaks, but for doing business with, the sort of leftish press?
But as it happens, when we get to the point of publication, you were more pilloried really than Alan. I mean, how did you kind of compare experiences about what happened when, what was the reaction, the temperature, if you like, both politically and sort of the ambient temperature when you press the publish button?
Well, I mean, both Alan and I went online to answer reader questions, and it was a sort of striking difference, which reflects both the difference between Europe and America and the difference between the Guardian's audience and ours. He got questions along the lines of, how dare you redact these documents, why don't you believe in transparency, publish it all. And I got emails that tended to be along the lines of, how dare you, you're putting your lives at risk, you're jeopardizing national security, the arrogance. I should say that was in the first days. The opinion evened out a bit as people actually read the articles and learned more about how we'd handled the material.
But do you feel that, I mean, we're sort of just going to move on to Jack in a second, but do you feel that you were actually, it felt to me sometimes as though the New York Times was really caught between a rock and a hard place, because there was pressure from those who were saying you were, and we'll talk about the kind of process of going to government in a minute, you were showing too little of what you could do, that you were being too establishment, and then obviously there was the Fox News faction that said that this was an anti-American act.
Right. I mean, we live between a rock and a hard place.
And it didn't get any softer.
No, it didn't get easier, and in fact, because there's been a sort of resurgence of emails and blog comments and Twitter and tweets in the last week or so since we released this ebook, that dichotomy is still there. I'm still getting messages from people who think that I'm unpatriotic, treasonous son of a bitch, and I'm getting some from people who think that Julian Assange is the Messiah, and why did I not treat him as such?
At this point, I just want to bring up Jack in, because we don't have anybody here from the State Department, much as we would like somebody. So could you sort of frame some of the issues for us, both kind of legally and, if you like, kind of ethically here? What was actually going on in the DOJ and government at this point, do you think?
There were a lot of cross-cutting political, and I assume, I've talked to a few people in the government, and it seems fairly obvious, that there are a lot of cross-cutting with political and legal considerations for the government to try to figure out what to do. This kind of happened over a long period of time, and the government knew that this was coming and really didn't take any steps until last summer, and affirmative steps at least it seemed. And the problem was that there wasn't much the government could do. There was no real technological response they could make to stop this from happening. There was no feasible military response they could make. There was no political response they could make. So really the only tool that the government was left with was some kind of legal response. And that's what, there's been enormous political pressure to do something about this. And right now the Holder Justice Department is obviously considering bringing some type of prosecution against Assange. The problem is that there are just enormous legal hurdles to bringing a successful prosecution against him. One set of hurdles is how do you get him to the United States? It's going to be a very difficult extradition proceeding. There's something called the political offense exception in extradition treaties, and a lot of other problems. So it's not at all clear we can even get him to the United States. And then once he gets here, it's not at all clear that there could be a successful prosecution. The laws governing or criminalizing the dissemination and publication of classified information for people who are not inside the government are extremely vague and old, almost 100 years old, and they've never ever in 220 years of our history been enforced against a journalist, a member of the media, or even a third party who's not a journalist who happens to come into possession of classified information outside the government. So the whole Justice Department has a lot of legal hurdles, and then another problem for them is it's very difficult to imagine, I can't think of one, a theory that would allow them, even if they could overcome these hurdles, allow them to prosecute Assange that wouldn't also sweep up Bill's journalists, because Assange is very similarly situated to the journalists in soliciting information if that's what he did from Bradley Manning. So those are the legal issues, then there are political issues on top of that that are cross-cutting as well, but those are the legal issues.
Well, I was going to ask you, how badly do you think the DOJ, people actually in the Department of Justice, I suppose the politicians want a prosecution on this? What are the tensions there?
My sense is that there's a lot of political pressure from the top, whether it's from Holder or the White House, I don't know. Certainly there's a ton of political pressure from Capitol Hill. It's very hard to, precisely because of the extreme difficulties of bringing and winning this prosecution, and of the difficulties of distinguishing American journalists from their everyday jobs, it's a very momentous step to take to bring this prosecution. And I imagine that the career lawyers, the Department of Justice has a long tradition of restraint against journalists and against enforcing criminal laws, and even subpoenas against the media. And I imagine that there's a great deal of discussion about the serious implications of going after someone like Assange because of the implications for the First Amendment, for the press generally. And then there's, of course, the government, if it tries and fails, in some sense it looks even weaker and worse, although on the other hand, maybe that's the solution. I imagine some people are thinking, we're under all this pressure to do something. If we do something and then a court tells us we can't do it, then it's not our fault. So that may be what some of the people are thinking.
If you were a betting man, I know that's probably not allowed in your state, but if you were a betting man, would you say that the prosecution is going to be brought or not?
I think that the political pressure being one is enormous and that there will be something brought, yes. I also don't think it will succeed.
Right. That's a good point at which to sort of talk about this classification and to talk specifically about Julian Assange. Because the point at which we were left it at publication, we haven't talked about the ruptured relationship. So in other words, Bill, you and the New York Times fell out with Assange pretty quickly, which was...
We got in his doghouse earlier than Alan, although we're both pretty deep in his doghouse now.
But the way that you ended up in the Chateau de Cham was really through a piece that you ran on the front of the New York Times about Assange, and also, he says, a lack of willingness to link to the WikiLeaks website during publication, which it has to be said does seem a sort of slightly odd decision.
But it certainly seemed odd to him. I'm happy to explain it. I should just state for the record, I've never met Julian Assange in person, but we've had a number of phone conversations. The first we had, all of them involved his various grievances against the New York Times. The first one came after the publication of the Afghanistan war logs, where he was upset that we did not link to the WikiLeaks website, and that we made a point of not linking to the WikiLeaks website. Obviously, readers of the New York Times are intelligent enough to find the WikiLeaks website without our help, so it was entirely a symbolic gesture on our part, but the reason we did it was because Assange had made it clear at that point that they did not intend to redact the documents in any way, and those documents contained, we know, many names of ordinary Afghans who, when they were approached by American military officers or officials, had answered questions, and said their names appeared innocently enough in these war logs, and publication of those names put their lives at risk. We and the Guardian and subsequently the other news organizations were careful to redact the names of people who might be killed or thrown in jail if their names became public. But at that early stage, Assange was not only reluctant to do that sort of redaction, he had actually, according to this interesting book that the Guardian has just published, told Guardian reporters that they were informants, they had it coming.
But let's just talk as well about the profile, because you've said that, and it was pretty personal. I mean, it was thorough. It was personal. You've gone on the record as saying that was a routine way to cover this kind of story. Surely it's not routine to treat somebody who is a source historian in that way, is it? Has the New York Times ever done it before?
I don't know, you'd have to go back to what we wrote about Daniel Ellsberg at the time of the Pentagon Papers, and I haven't done that. It certainly felt routine at the time, given that we were hearing from a number of people within WikiLeaks kind of cries of distress about the way Assange was handling himself. That seemed to be something that should be included in a profile of this man who had acquired a large profile, in some part thanks to us. And we reported on the dissension within the ranks of WikiLeaks, the unhappiness of some WikiLeaks members over their initial refusal to redact, their comments about his management style and so on. I mean, he's called it a smear and a hatchet job. I don't think it was those things at all, but it was, we didn't say, well, he's our source, we'll go easy on him.
The fact that you had a slightly sort of, if you like, kind of intermediated relationship with him through Alan here, was that actually something of a relief, or was it a frustration?
At times it was both. I mean, at different times it was a relief and a problem, and particularly when he started to become sort of visibly agitated at the times. The first over our decision not to link. Second, he took offense at a profile we wrote of Bradley Manning, and then subsequently his anguish over the profile that John Burns wrote on our front page. On each of those occasions, I proposed to come over, meet with him, sit down, and have dinner. I just thought, there is something known in the trade as source maintenance. It involves, a certain amount of,
dinner.
Yeah, dinner and beverages, and things of that sort, and conversation. And you try to explain why you do what you do, and they explain why they do things the way they do.
And Alan, just to bring you in here, because you maintained a relationship with WikiLeaks after the times had been cut, though you actually enraged them somewhat, I believe, by insisting on supplying or continuing to supply information to the New York Times. How did your split with WikiLeaks as your collaborators happen?
Well, there were two problems, I think. One is about the nature of what Julian Assange was. So he's a source, questionable. Is he a source? Because actually it seems to me he's probably not a source. He's a kind of new breed of intermediary or entrepreneur or activist.
Or journalist.
He calls himself editor-in-chief, which I think is probably a smart thing to do because it brings in First Amendment, and that's why he was keen to be a publisher as well. So he's many things, and he wears different hats at different times, and he's also building a WikiLeaks brand. Good luck to him. But the part of the WikiLeaks brand says, leak stuff to me, not to those mainstream media people who you can't trust. So, our interests are not completely aligned. But I think this business of him being a source when he chooses to be and saying I need protection as a source is a bit problematic. And the second problem is, for us, so the second general problem is this problem of communication. So at a certain point, he just disappeared. And we now know he was living the life of Downton Manor or Gosford Park in Suffolk, but we had no idea where he was, and we couldn't bring him up, we couldn't speak to him, we couldn't meet him. He wouldn't use email, and we could just do encrypted messaging at points when he would pop up, which was increasingly. So a lot of this was stuff.
But you knew where his lawyer was? I mean, it might.
As the story I'm about to tell, that was not a reliable source of channel communication. But I think what Bill says is right. If in normal circumstances you could have met for a drink or a chat, picked up the phone, and a lot of these misunderstandings I think wouldn't have happened. So I think sometimes, you know, I even wrote Julian a letter in December, an old-fashioned letter, and posted it to Suffolk.
On paper?
On paper, to try and sort of have a conversation. And normally, on occasions where we all sat down face to face, he might begin angry, but normally by the end would be fine. So there was a communication, there was the nature of the beast, you know, who is he and how many hats is he wearing? And then all this collided, you know, rather unhappily with the Swedish sex charges, which had nothing at all to do with our collaboration over the journalism and the documents. And at some point, while Julian was, in my view, wrongly in prison, so communication almost impossible, except through his solicitor, somebody sent Nick Davis, the original reporter who was the good guy at that point, the information about the sex charges. Now, you know, ethical dilemma. Do you say he's our source? We shouldn't write about this because we have to protect him. That didn't seem to us a tenable position. At that point, the women in the sex charge case, not that there have been any charges, but the sex accusation case, were being absolutely rubbished on the internet. And I have to say by Julian's lawyers, who described this as a honey trap, which I take to mean that they deliberately set out to entrap Julian, for which there's no evidence yet. But I don't believe that to be the case. And we thought it's about time that I think we had an obligation to set out in the public domain what we knew, because that's what journalists do. And we went to Julian's lawyers and said, we're intending to do this, but and he said, please, give us a couple of days, 5 o'clock Friday, I'll come back to you, and then you can run his side of the case. And 5 o'clock came, and they didn't. And I think at that moment, Julian felt very cross with us. There was a kind of sort of, I think he felt a sort of breach of trust. But this was, a unique set of circumstances.
I mean, a question I'd like both you and Bill to answer really is that, Julian Assange he doesn't have the luxury of your investigative journalists, in that he doesn't have an organisation of the scale that you have behind him. His life is altered forever now. You both have published books, e-book and a paper book this week, which kind of really sort of capitalise on your knowledge of him. Do you not feel a duty of care? In other words, you kind of made a case saying it's very much his.
Yes, I mean, he's been paid £1 million to write a book about the case too. So I mean, it's not that he's he has the perfect ability to say what he wants to say. And in fact, if you follow the voice on Twitter that says it is Wikileaks, which I take to be Julian, he's not backward in coming forward and saying what he says. We were both sleazy news organisations, and we've been upgraded this week to being a slimy news organisation.
But you did both say that he smelt and that was wearing dirty socks. So I mean,
but I mean, so the point of that, in as much as he is a source and or a partner in this collaboration, if God forbid ever this came to court, I would be completely side with him. I'm sure Bill would, in terms of defending him and in respect of what we did. I mean, he's done some stuff on his own website that I'm not sure I would have done, and I don't see the need to defend that. But in respect of the partnership and the joint exercise, completely shoulder to shoulder, and I've got great admiration for him in respect of a lot of the stuff he's done. But the Swedish sex stuff has got nothing to do with that at all.
So if it should end up as Jack was saying, possibly in a prosecution, would you be standing shoulder to shoulder with WikiLeaks?
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I think probably at the Times lawyers would prefer that I not declare what we would do in a court of law. But I'll tell you what I would do outside of a court of law. I mean, I absolutely agree with what Jack said earlier, that it's very hard to conceive of a prosecution of Julian Assange that wouldn't stretch the law in a way that would be applicable to us. And I think whatever one thinks of Julian Assange, certainly American journalists and other journalists should feel a sense of alarm at any legal action that intends to punish Assange for doing essentially what journalists do, that is to say, any use of the law to criminalize the publication of secrets.
And Jack, just sort of on that point, I mean, you're very clear that there is no difference between journalists and Julian Assange, which is something actually, Bill, you've disagreed with in the past when you said that he's...
No, not in terms of the law.
It's very hard.
Again, I'm not a lawyer, but no, just so we're clear on the record, I think, and I've said on several occasions that I think somebody in my job should be fairly humble about deciding who gets to call themselves a journalist. There's not we don't pass out membership cards to that fraternity. If he wants to call himself that, that's fine. I've said I don't think of him as a journalist in the form that we practice it. But in terms of his right to be protected again for publishing secrets, I think we do stand alongside him.
Jack, you've been on the end of inquiries from journalists at the New York Times. How different are they?
I don't think there's much. Well, I would agree with Bill that as an institution, WikiLeaks is quite different from the New York Times, and that's obviously true. But I think that the job that Assange and WikiLeaks is performing is functionally identical to what Bill's dozen or so national security reporters do every day. They talk to people in the government, they try to get them to tell them things, they try to get them to tell classified things, they help them, encourage them to give them documents that are classified. And that's part of this very complicated and strange game we have in America where the government tries to play the game of keeping its secrets and it punishes its people if they disclose them. But the press has to some degree, First Amendment protected right to go after this information. It's a game that plays out every day in Washington, D.C., and I don't see how the reporter is any different in sort of his relationship to a government official leaking classified information from Bill's journalists.
Can we talk now, so just moving away from Assange and WikiLeaks and more about the overall impact of the cables and the story? And we've heard this, we've had this debate over the past weeks and months, which is, just how significant is it, both in terms of the impact of the stories, but also in terms of the impact that it's having on journalism. And Bill, I know that you were saying, I think I heard you at the weekend saying, it hasn't turned journalism on its head. It seems to have kind of given it a pretty nasty shake.
Yeah, but journalism has been transformed in the last few years. There's no question about it. The migration of both the audience and the revenues to the internet have changed our business model. They've accelerated the speed of everything. I think they've eroded significantly privacy and secrecy. All of that happened before WikiLeaks came on the scene. I think in that respect they sort of are representative of a trend that is at large in journalism, but they didn't initiate it, or they aren't the first manifestation of it. They are a very big manifestation of it.
But how's it made you think about the things that perhaps the New York Times didn't feel it had to think about before and might have to think about now? Does it change the way that you do your job? Well, for instance, if you are going to be using the web to store large amounts of data or archive files, the idea that this is not a kind of a public space, it's actually a commercial space, and if an Amazon decides that for perfectly good commercial reasons it doesn't want you to let you have its service space, if like Alan says he has, sometimes sort of negotiating the right technical skills within the organisation to redact and sort the data, in other words, are you treating this as an anomaly, or are you thinking this is just going to happen more and more frequently in the future, and we need to address these issues as well?
I think it's a difference from what's gone before only in scale. We have redacted documents before, we certainly have stored documents before, we've worried about the security of documents that were electronically stored before, never on this scale. We've never really, as Alan said, had this kind of an archive delivered at once and had to get our arms around it. So I think it probably accelerated our development of the skills to handle large amounts of data. There certainly are a few people in our newsroom who are a lot smarter about how to create a searchable database, how to protect it, how to search it in a constructive way than we were before. So in that respect, it's been a real education.
And what about, Alan, do you feel that it's, Bill's saying this has been journalism has been changing for a while, there's just a prism through which to view it. How do you feel The Guardian has, because it's had a much bigger impact, if you like, on The Guardian as a UK publisher, which is now abroad in the world as a sort of a key news brand that people cite on this story all the time?
Well, I think the good thing for mainstream media has been that it showed the skills that we have been really valuable. I mean, this story would have had a fraction of the impact that it had it not been for Bill's reporters, our European colleagues' reporters going through finding the stories, which were not sitting there on trees waiting to be picked. They had to be found, and there was an awful lot of expert information from people who'd been in those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq who could find it, from Russia, from China, experts on climate change. It took a lot of, and I think Julian Assange has said that business of finding, verifying, contextualizing, that's been a tremendous affirmation of old media skills. I think on the technological front, it's been a real challenge, wake-up call. The business of making whistleblowing safe, I think, is something that we hadn't given enough thought to, and I think we don't have enough expertise in. The business of stripping metadata out of documents in an age when everything has a digital fingerprint, I don't think we thought enough about. I think the challenge from organisations like Wikileaks and OpenLeaks about the nature of transparency is a challenge to us. It's made us think about, and to government. I think, I would really like to see an academic institution look at the way the sky hasn't fallen in, with the biggest exercise in transparency any of us has known, and look at the upside and downside, because I think that might be important about how government works in the future. And the third bit of it is the publishing bit. So there's the sort of making the document safe, there's analysing it, and then the publishing bit. And I think there are huge legal and technological and future of journalism questions there involved in these other kinds of organisations, WikiLeaks and OpenLeaks being two of them, who want to get now into the business of receiving documents and publishing them. Julian's, erecting a whole philosophy about what he calls scientific journalism. We're going to be not like the old mainstream media. We'll actually show you the documents, and there's something in that, and also the legal challenges. I mean, OpenLeaks, they don't want money, but they do want server capacity. So they want to be able to do whatever technologists do. They smash all this information up into millions of atomic particles, to use a technical term.
Tiny pieces.
Tiny pieces, and they want to have our servers in order to host them. Now, we haven't begun to think of the legal implications of having these tiny pieces on our servers, whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. But these are the kind of issues that we're going to have to start thinking about another round.
I mean, there's a huge issue, isn't there, here, Jack? How does this impact on, if you like, the future of the internet, the regulation of the internet, and how we should think about what in Britain we would call the digital fourth estate, the freedom of the press in that context?
Right. I tend to agree with Bill that this is more of an evolution than a sharp break from what's been going on in the last 10 years. At least 10 years. I mean, the last 10 years this is really the culmination of the digitalization of information and the fact that the costs of copying and distributing information has plummeted to nearly zero. And that, combined with the sort of enormous growth in the secrecy system, has led to a dynamic where secret stuff has been flowing out of the government for a lot, in an unprecedented way in the last 10 years. And I do think, though, I agree with Alan also that the key innovation here is the kind of the technological empowerment of the whistleblower. And I think that while these documents, actually, there's so many of them and there's so many famous people involved in them, the truth is there's a debate about how harmful they've been at all. And they're just secret, they're not top secret, there's no, these are not intelligence documents. And so I think that that this event is going to seem less significant over time. It's going to be seen as part of a larger continuum of the digitalization of information, the great difficulty that the government has in keeping secrets. And there's going to be an arms race between the government and the media is going to transform itself. There are going to be a million WikiLeaks. The New York Times is going to be a WikiLeaks. I predict that all of these institutions will build these type of capacities. And then there's going to be an arms race with the government, because the government is going to lock itself down. And so that's going to be the dynamic, and I think that the government will largely lose that arms race.
Just on that point, I mean, Bill, you were quoted again earlier in the week as saying that you were thinking about something like the transparency unit at Al Jazeera, which is a kind of a mini WikiLeaks. I'd just like to ask you now, what are the implications of that? Because again, it seems to me that there's something of relief, isn't there, having somebody who's as technically adept as Julian Assange, who actually takes delivery of these things. If you're actually taking delivery of them, how can you be sure, as editors and editors-in-chief of your organisations, that you can honestly say that your servers are secure?
Well, that's one of the principal complications in this question of whether you want to open up a kind of drop box of your own, or taken to calling an easy pass lane for whistleblowers. And we've had people in our computer-assisted reporting unit and interactive news unit looking at this for a while. Technically, it's not that hard. There are some legal questions involved, but the biggest question really is if something comes in over the transom and it's essentially anonymous, how do you vet it? That does complicate the business of finding out whether the information is legitimate. So that's why we have not yet decided to go ahead with this project. We may, but that's the question that we have to get past.
In Jack's point that there's going to be a million WikiLeaks out, will the Guardian be a WikiLeak?
I suppose we have been for centuries. I mean, people have been giving us documents since 1821. I think there is going to be competition now between us and the sort of OpenLeaks, WikiLeaks style operations, and Bill's right. These are conversations we're now having about just how difficult it is, and Der Spiegel, I know, want to build their own Dropbox system. If you speak to Daniel Domscheit-Berg, as I did last week in Munich, he says it's a bit harder than you old media guys think, and he's offering to build it for us and to create a little mail at the Guardian box, which he would come straight to us. But there are all kinds of complications. Then you've got this document that's got no metadata. You don't know who the source is. You don't know how to get in touch with the source, and so there are real problems whichever way you turn.
To say it's not just competition between traditional media and these new WikiLeaks intermediaries. It's also quite strangely competition with national intelligence services. We're also in the business of trying to uncover secrets of other governments, and I think it's going to have a dynamic on that as well. I mean, this is what the CIA is, what all of our intelligence services try to do. They try to uncover secrets from other countries that will help us further our national security. They would prefer to do it and know about it themselves alone, and now they have competition that's going to publish it, that's going to shape it in ways that's going to alter the way intelligence services think about spying.
Do you also think, just sort of to return briefly, that given that Assange is a source or wears a number of hats, but essentially is an intermediary, if you're of a generation that sees WikiLeaks actually carrying a mission and carrying it out rather better than the press, there's an awful lot of people who feel that the mainstream media has not served them very well in the past 10 years in terms of financial collapse, wars, illegal and otherwise. Isn't this just a wider problem than who's got a secure server? It's also how do you reinvent yourselves? Do you want to reinvent yourselves for that part of the audience?
It's a useful thought experiment just to wonder what would have happened if Nick Davis hadn't sought down Julian Assange. Now, I don't know what the internal story within WikiLeaks at that point was. but suppose they had just decided to publish, I think the story would have had very little impact, because the average member of the public logging into that database would have found what we found on day one, just a mass of impenetrable data. The number of people who would have searched through the information or found anything of value would have been tiny. There would have been intelligence services and people who would have been keenly interested in it, but it would have had almost no political impact. And that's why I say, actually, we shouldn't be too craven about standing up for what traditional journalism has done in this case. It has found the stories, it's given them huge currency and saliency, and it's done so in an entirely safe way. No one's been able to prove that anyone has come to any harm, and that's because of the people working for Bill and for us and for Rusbridger and the milk buddies who worked exhaustively to make sure that those documents were safe. So
I'm not so sure that when I play the mind game that you propose, that it comes out quite the same way. I absolutely agree with you that the public was well served, and actually Wikileaks was well served by having mainstream news organizations give it professional attention, highlight what was important, treat it responsibly, and give it wide circulation. But in this day and age, I think if the material had just been dumped on a website without being given in advance to serious news organizations, some very interesting people would have found it and gotten into it. I mean, we're in, as you know very well, we're in the era of crowdsourcing, and most crowds include people with a lot of expertise. And so I do rather think that what you would have had is a cacophony. You would have had people mining it and finding things and using it for different, even competing aims, using it to attack a government, attack a policy, to defend a policy, to defend the government, and there would have been probably a great deal of confusion, but I don't think it would have gone unnoticed, or even unmined.
I'm sure that's right. But whether it would have, what would have resulted at the end, whether that would have been at all cohesive, and the extent to which it would have had the same impact through simultaneous publishing around the world. And we did an interesting crowdsourcing exercise at the end. So having found all the stories we thought we could find, I just tweeted and said, look, does anybody think we're missing stuff? What would you be searching for? Give us some search terms and dates, and we'll look. And that, so we had about 3,000 replies to that, which we did look at. It hadn't occurred to us to look up Madeleine McCann, the child who disappeared in Portugal, and it turned out there was quite an interesting story there. And every conspiracy theorist in the world asked us to check out their particular conspiracy, and it produced some material, but actually it didn't produce the sort of gems that I thought were.
I wonder if somebody would have teased out the cables on Tunisia, and if it would have had the same impact that
Jack.
You wouldn't have just left these amazing documents to the bloggers. You might not have put quite as many intense resources on them as you did having access to them and having a first shot at them. But I'm sure that you would have put a lot of reporters plowing through those, and so it would have still gotten the salience. And the war logs themselves didn't reveal as many stories, I think, as these did. So I think it still would have had a large impact, because I think you would have, in combination with the bloggers and the crowdsourcing, would have been all over.
We would have been in the feeding frenzy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So just sort of bringing us up to date, we mentioned earlier on, Alan, so there was a collective decision made on the 22nd of December to bring down the curtain, as you put it. Well, what did you mean by that?
Well, originally we had decided that we would carry on the first week of January, but we had anxieties at that point about these documents leaking.
That's an understandable anxiety.
How shocking. There was a moment where we thought they'd all turned up in a Beirut newspaper, a strange man in Russia and Belarus who appeared to be selling the documents. They turned up suddenly at an afternoon newspaper in Norway. So there was a sense of that these documents were out and about, and I thought at the moment we're very happy with what we've done, we can defend it, and it's been a good exercise in collaboration. But over the next month, anything can happen. These documents can turn up anywhere, redacted or unredacted. So why don't we just make a clean announcement that we're now ending our exclusive relationship with Julian, and he's now free to do what he wants with them. Just so that it was a kind of sort of marker. And I'm glad that we did that. And I'm glad that we put it on the record, because I was surprised to read on Sunday in the Telegraph, Julian claiming that he had kicked us out because he had doubts about us.
This is the UK paper that's now picked up the relationship.
I think the FT is now in, and so you're going to have a lot of other news organisations, and I think that's good. That's good luck to them. As I would say, as long as they behave with a similar kind of ethical framework as we did, because they will undoubtedly find things that we didn't find. But I think we all had anxieties about the point where we were apparently the exclusive partners, but in fact this information was now going to start leaking out across the world in forms that we might not publish it.
So this was a sort of footnote and point of clarification. It doesn't mean that we've stopped, nor have the Guardian stopped using them. We have 750,000 documents counting the war logs and the embassy cables. There's some small fraction of them that have been read, and an even smaller fraction of them that have been published. And it's just sort of events.
Amazing resource for years to come. As other figures emerge in the Egyptian story and the Tunisia story, you can go back into the documents and say, okay, so what do we know about that?
So just to clarify this for people who are trying to imagine this, when you say we have them, so this is again something which I think people are not entirely clear on. You actually still have access to the entire cache of data, and it is sitting somewhere on your collective servers, but you feel that you've gone as far as you can in terms of turning up interesting things.
Well, we did, I won't say the obvious things, but we did the things that occurred to us after we'd all sort of brainstormed about what would be interesting to search for, because that's really the way we had these documents, was through search. You would search for a term, a subject, a country, a person. But there are lots of things that we didn't think to search for. I mean, prior to the last week or so, we would not have thought to search for Suleiman in Egypt, I don't think. But suddenly he pops up, and of course, now we have this resource that we can go to and see if there's anything that we ought to know about him that isn't sort of otherwise obtainable. And
you see, again, Bill, you said earlier this week that you felt that it probably, some of the stories that had emerged would have had some effect on Tunisia. So again, that's not necessarily kind of a verifiable fact, it's more of a...
What we believe from reporting in Tunisia is not that the WikiLeaks documents started the uprising, but that they clearly feel that they were on social media all over the place in Tunisia and fueled the anger, the reports of the sort of high living of the royal elite. And I suppose you could say that to the extent that Tunisia inspired the events in Egypt, the WikiLeaks had some sort of second-order effect in Egypt as well.
I'm going to go to the audience for questions in 1 second. Just to sort of, Jack, we talked about what this might mean for journalism in the future. Jack, we've talked about a possible prosecution, but what are the wider things now that the US government are thinking about? You said they had a lot of warning, really, that this was going to happen. They knew that this kind of data cache was coming for some time. Is there a speeding up now in the thought process?
There has been, especially since the war logs were published last summer, there's been a speeding up of trying to figure out what to do about this. It's a problem inside the government because the 9/11 Commission report criticized the government for being too stovepipe, for not sharing information enough inside the government, and that was one reason why the 9/11 Commission said 9/11 happened. We just couldn't connect the dots. And so the government has been in this exercise in the last 10 years of sharing information more widely, but that has the result that if more people see it and have access to it, it's easier to leak out. So the government is trying to beef up its security and try to find the right kind of trade-off between sharing information inside the government and worrying about excessive sharing that may lead to excessive leaking. That and these larger legal issues is really having a hard time figuring out what to do.
Okay, we have roving lights in the audience, and if you have a question, please hold your hand up. We have one over there. We're all about transparency here this evening, so if you could say just briefly who you are and where you're from, and please try and frame it as a question, and stand up so everyone can see you. Thank you.
My name is Khan Ross. I'm a former British diplomat, and I've been reading a lot of the cables actually at the Wikileaks site itself, which has been extraordinarily interesting. And I wanted to ask a question about the editorial decision about what not to publish, and particularly not so much the harm, not so much the criterion of the harm to individuals, but the possible political consequence of certain cables, which I believe many of which are actually extraordinarily significant. There's one, for instance, which I think the Guardian reported, but the New York Times did not, which revealed that the US is conducting secret aerial surveillance of Lebanon at the request of parts of the Lebanese government, which in Lebanese terms is a very extraordinary revelation, not least that the US surveillance is undoubtedly of Hezbollah positions, intelligence which is undoubtedly shared with Israel. So this is a pretty toxic revelation in Lebanese terms, and yet the New York Times chose, as far as I'm aware, I may be wrong because I haven't read every story the Times has done there, the New York Times chose not to publish, not to talk about that cable, and I think the Guardian did, but again I may be wrong about that. So could you explain, was there a process of considering the political consequence of these cables?
Bill, do you want to tackle that one first? Because again, you actually went to the State Department, didn't you? Did you actually? And you actually showed them the material. Is that right?
We showed them the cables. We did not show them the articles. First of all, in that particular Lebanese, we did not decide not to run it. It just never came to our attention. I mean, we did not. The collaboration between the Times and the Guardian was not such that we were showing each other what we planned to write about in detail. And as far as I know, we never had a discussion one way or the other about whether the overflights in Lebanon should be written about. But the mechanics of it, they evolved over. On the military dispatches, we had very little interaction with the government because they didn't want much. I think the Pentagon's reaction was that dealing with us, engaging us on this would imply some sort of endorsement of what we'd done. The State Department took a different tack, although they were clearly furious with us for having, furious about the fact that these documents were out there, and deeply worried about what the consequences would be for our relations with a number of countries. And the procedure that we settled on with them is that a couple of days before we were planning to publish an article on subject X, we would send them the cables that we intended to draw on for that article and offer them the opportunity to say, you should not publish this cable, you should not publish this portion of the cable. In some cases, we decided they were right, and in some cases, we disagreed with them. The easy ones were, of course, the names of academics, human rights advocates, and so on. Although names of high-level people, they, on a number of occasions, wanted us to redact because of the potential for diplomatic embarrassment, and there we almost invariably declined to redact.
What about Alan? Was it very different in terms of you presumably had very little contact with the UK government, or did you?
We had virtually no contact with the UK government. I mean, I think Bill was in a much harder position than we were, because they're basically his country's secrets, not ours. But there were difficult areas. I mean, Lebanon was one, Yemen was another. The State Department were extremely anxious about Yemen, and we had a lot of discussions among the founders. So we were having regular conference calls, and there were some people who were divided about Yemen. And basically, the case there was, you're playing with fire if you publish this stuff. Yemen is this kind of front line in the battle with the Islamist insurgency, and you've got a president who is, has been caught saying, "My country is your country," and if you publish this, he could fall, and the whole deck of cards. And in the end, I think we we came to the view that that's a political embarrassment issue. It's not a security issue. And and simultaneously we did a story about how he'd squirreled away allegedly $9 billion offshore, and today he's decided that he's going to not contest the next election. So, I mean, it comes back to again, it's a useful thought experiment. If it turns out that Wikileaks could play a part in that, it's for historians to decide whether that was a good thing or a bad thing.
And just on that sort of political point of process, even though you didn't show the cable material to the State Department, but you did speak to them, did you? Did you come to America? Or did you?
We played that role on behalf of the European groups as well.
Right. Okay. So that was actually a
sort of and on a few occasions, that the Yemen one was probably the most sort of robust discussion we had among ourselves. After the State Department was quite firm in its belief that publishing that cable would present serious difficulties for the Saudi government, but we all published it.
Did you? So was there any point in which you were trying to sort of influence each other? So would you ever say to them, "I think you're wrong about that," or was there?
Sometimes we just agree to differ. So there are again, there will be geeks who will someday pore over all this and find the points of difference and find that the New York Times did different things from us. And to that degree, we were taking independent judgment.
There are several questions. Should we go here, and then here? Yeah.
This is a question along similar lines for Mr. Rusbridger. In late December, The Guardian published a cable that originated in the U.S. Embassy in London called The Visit to the Finsbury Park Mosque, which has since been pulled. I'm wondering why that cable specifically was pulled, and also, more generally, what goes into The Guardian's decision-making process when deciding to actually sort of reclassify cables that had originally been published on The Guardian's website.
The question was that you believe that there was a cable called A Visit to the Finsbury Park Mosque.
It was from November 8th, 2007, from the U.S. Embassy in London.
And that it appeared on the website and then was
It's still, if you go to the portal on the Guardian's website, it's still listed under cables that originated at that embassy, but you get a 404 if you click on it. And from what I understand, there have been journalists who have tried to get a copy of the cable from the Guardian, and the Guardian's declined to give it to them. So I'm wondering if you have any background on that.
Well, the allegation is that if you click on the Visit to the Finsbury Park Mosque cable now, that you just get a 404, and that when people have made inquiries about if they can get a copy of the cable or have it put back up, there's been a negative answer.
I generally don't know anything about it, but I'll give you my email address afterwards.
I hesitate to suggest that it may just be a broken link, obviously, because the Guardian website is among the best run in the world. I never used to return sorry pages in my day.
Hi, Mark Gelman from Time Magazine. Bill, would you care to say any more about the passage in your magazine piece about the apparent hacking of your email accounts? What you think the purpose and effect of that was? And relatedly, for any of you, do you have any doubt that the mainstream media partners of WikiLeaks were probably the juiciest target for foreign intelligence services who wanted to get the whole WikiLeaks trove, including the 99% that has yet to be published?
So yes, how badly were you hacked?
I don't want to say very much about this because we're still in the process of investigating it, which is extremely complicated. It involves getting access to some places that are difficult to get access to. I mean, we have a computer forensics specialist who's looking at these. There were three individuals, one in the U.S., one in the U.K., and one in Germany, who all had virtually identical eruptions, shall we say, of their email accounts. They were all the same email server, and the forensics expert who looked at ours said it was clearly hacked. But They didn't leave any fingerprints that are readily available, so we're sort of taking it to the next level.
If you find...
Yeah, well, I'm sorry.
On this excellent book, which the entire contents of this appeared on the Amazon website on Friday evening. And I hadn't realised how difficult it is to complain to Amazon, but when I got through to customer service and asked them to take it down, although it was the American edition, they said it had been uploaded from the UK. We started looking at it, and we noticed there were lots of bits missing, which generally were the bits that were unfavourable to Julian Assange. So somebody had gone to the trouble of hacking the book and posting it in its entirety on Amazon in a redacted form. So I make no complaints, but it was...
But you also went to some lengths, as well as writing letters, which is obviously quite an extreme length these days, but you went to some lengths to protect communications, including using techniques that you'd learned from The Wire. Is that right? With your burner phones.
Humiliating.
It's just journalistic line of inquiry.
But just as when I originally rang Bill and asked him if the line was secure, and we had no knowledge of whether... I mean, it seemed to be reasonable to be paranoid that somebody might be trying to put this and that. So we went out and bought a lot of, as I understand, they're called burners, but then made the elementary mistake of then ringing existing numbers from burners, which completely compromised the burners. So we were total amateurs.
So, Jack, as somebody who's been in government, would they? Do you think they would be right to be paranoid, these editors, about electronic activity in their accounts?
There's a much bigger thing going on with the government, much larger than Wikileaks, cyber espionage. The government is mortified by it. The government's been hacked all over the place. They see this as a serious national security problem. This is the problem with cybersecurity more generally. And what's happening in this context, like in every other context in the digital world, is surveillance is becoming decentralized, and governments are being hacked by governments. They're being hacked by large criminal organizations. This is part of a much bigger problem, and I'm sure that organizations like the New York Times and the Guardian are regularly as well. It's very hard to detect. It's not terribly easy to terribly difficult to accomplish, and so it's that part of this story about breaking in and stealing information is part of a much larger change in the world.
But not necessarily done by the US government.
Not necessarily
done by the US government.
Well, the National Security Agency does something. I'm not quite sure what it does, but I think that's what it does.
To a few years ago.
Yes. Question there, Nick. Question.
Right. I wanted to get the panelists to respond to what's, I guess, currently the state of play with the government acting through various officials and agencies to intimidate people who act in the commercial space to provide services that benefit organizations like Wikileaks, and particularly, do you see any sort of de facto infringement on First Amendment rights because of that?
That's a very interesting one. I mean, Jack,
I didn't actually hear that, I'm sorry.
This is about responding to the idea that pressure is brought to bear on, political pressure is brought to bear on commercial players as well, who are perhaps aiding.
This is about PayPal.
This is about PayPal and Visa and Amazon in particular, who took Wikileaks as a service.
I'm not sure if it was political pressure or commercial pressure.
Well, Joe Lieberman rang up. I don't know. Does that count as political pressure?
I think they were more worried about their business than they were about the government cracking down. But I don't know.
Is it something? I mean, it seemed to me that was actually quite a worrying trend that came out of this. Was, as I say, realising that what we thought was the free space of the internet is actually largely privatised, which I suppose if you think about it for 2 seconds is obvious. But Aaron, what's your thought?
Well, I Khashoggi read a very good post in the week after that happened, which I think I agree with, which is basically saying, go through the front door. If you're going to tackle Assange, take him to court. Don't try and destroy him by blocking him, by sort of cutting off his finances. And I suspect there was political pressure there, or if there wasn't, then they would say that the commercial companies were behaving cravenly. So I would much rather, I don't want to see him prosecuted, but I'd much rather we had a court case, and it was done openly and above board through legal means and through these kind of...
This is the way the government controls the internet. The government puts pressure on the Googles of the world and the Visas of the world when there's something happening abroad, and Visa or Google or an internet service provider is the intermediary, and the government, this happens all the time, today, in all sorts of contexts. When the government wants to get at the offshore harm that's on the internet, they can't get at the actual source of the harm, so they go after the intermediary and they put pressure on it. It's nothing new, it's nothing unlawful at all. And you don't have, there are different types of lawful pressure the government can bring to bear. And are we sure that it was the government that was pressuring these institutions to cut WikiLeaks off? Is that established?
It was on the record that as I say, whether Jay Lieberman's office counts as political pressure, but calls have been made, and this was reported, I think, in both the Guardian and
But I don't consider that legal pressure. I consider that, to the extent that counts as political pressure, it's because he's stirring up their customers.
Okay. Question there, and then one over there, and then a couple down here.
Hi, this question is regarding the implications of this sort of for the future of journalism. It was remarked at the beginning this is sort of a unique collaboration between two large publications, and I believe that right now the Guardian is also collaborating on its coverage of Egypt with some other organizations. And I'm wondering, Bill mentioned that, you know, even had these documents not gone to these organizations, that there are a lot of people out there who would have analyzed them and raised questions about them. And that the difference with this was one of scale, $500,000. And what do you all think of there being a place, or is there a place, what's going to have to happen in the way that we handle news and these massive dumps of data as news staffs are shrinking around the world? Will there be a sort of second tier or an additional tier of analysis that of analyzers who collaborate with newsrooms in new and different ways to sort of make getting these stories out more feasible? And should we expect more of this kind of collaboration to keep news organizations relevant in a future atmosphere?
Alan, you spoke a lot about mutualisation, and that's talking about this layer of collaboration. But actually, WikiLeaks, apart from the sort of collaboration with Bill and your source, wasn't enormously mutual, sort of apart from a Twitter question at the end. Do you see doing things differently in the future, or blend of the two?
Well, I think Julian Assange is doing a very interesting thing next with these documents, which I think, we in a sense had our agreement and we moved out of the way. Otherwise, I think we would do this, which is to now partner with news organisations all the way around the world to find that sort of second layer of stories. We had an Indian journalist who went through the 3,000 Indian cables, and she said that basically 30 front-page splashes in Indian terms, which could have enormous impact in India, but probably only 4 stories that anybody else in the world is going to care about immediately. So there's 26 stories just about India waiting to be published. And I think Julian's idea at the moment, which is to find the sort of Guardian, New York Times equivalents in India and Russia and so on, seems to be an intelligent way to proceed to get to the next rank of stories. So I think the ripples from this will continue in ways that are unpredictable. But I think that's quite an intelligent approach to how to do it. I think that, it handles this problem that there are genuine problems in releasing all this data, which might not be true with other data sets.
On the question of collaboration, first, just as a point of historical interest, this was neither the first nor the largest news media collaboration that I've been involved in. Back in 2000, quite a number of American news organizations got together and to recount the votes in Florida at the contested Florida primary.
How did that go?
If you counted things the way the Florida courts wanted them counted, then Bush won. If you counted them the way Gore originally said he wanted them counted, which is every vote should count, then Gore won. So anyway.
Okay. Yes, I've got sort of we're running out of time, but there are a few questions down here, so if we can start at the back, then we'll try and, if we go quickly, we'll probably get them all in.
Yeah, hi. Steve Peterson from the School of International and Public Affairs. Mr. Rusbridger, you mentioned how the cables leaked to other newspapers in the end and how your relationship with Assange ended that way. What do you guys know about how it ended up with